In March of 1959, during a routine inventory transfer at the abandoned Halbrook County Hospital in rural eastern Kentucky, two state archivists discovered a locked filing cabinet wedged behind a collapsed boiler in the basement. The cabinet had no identifying marks. Inside were 247 photographs, each labeled only with a patient number, a date, and a single word, contraindicated. The images showed children with faces that didn't align, eyes set at angles that defied symmetry, limbs that terminated in clusters of boneless fingers, spines that curved in ways no medical textbook had ever documented. And in nearly every photograph, scrawled in pencil on the back, were two surnames repeated over and over again: Torrance and Cade. The archivists reported their findings to the Kentucky Department of Health. Within 48 hours, a federal marshal arrived, confiscated the photographs, and informed both men that they had signed a retroactive non-disclosure agreement under the Public Health Service Act of 1944. The photographs were never catalogued. The hospital was demolished 6 months later. But the archivists had already made copies. Before we open this file, subscribe and comment what state you're watching from. It helps us bring these buried stories back into the light. Halbrook County sits in the Cumberland Plateau, a region of Kentucky so remote that even today, some valleys have no cell service. In the 1800s, it was effectively a kingdom unto itself, a patchwork of isolated hollers where families lived, bred, and died without ever seeing a courthouse or a census taker. The Torrance family arrived in the region in 1821, according to land deeds filed in the neighboring county. They purchased 840 acres of forested ridgeline for less than the cost of a horse. The Cades came a decade later, settling in the valley directly below Torrance land. By 1840, both families had intermarried so thoroughly that the county's sole church ledger, maintained by a traveling Baptist minister, listed only 5 distinct surnames across 43 recorded births. The minister's notes are unsettling. In the margin beside a baptism entry for Silas Torrence-Cade, born 1852, the minister wrote, "Father and grandfather same man. Mother is sister to father's first wife, now deceased. Infant malformed. Declined baptism. Family insists." The minister stopped visiting Halbrook County in 1856. His final entry reads, "I will not return. God has no dominion here." By the 1880s, the Torrence-Cade line had become what one regional historian would later describe as a genetic cul-de-sac. Marriage records show that between 1850 and 1900, there were at least 19 documented unions between first cousins, 6 between uncles and nieces, and 3 between brothers and the same woman in sequential marriages. The bloodline didn't branch, it coiled. And something began to show in the children. In 1911, Dr. Amos Field Marsh, a physician from Lexington, was hired by the newly formed Kentucky Bureau of Vital Statistics to conduct a health survey of the state's most isolated counties. Halbrook was on his list. His report, filed in October of that year, was never published, but a typescript copy survived in the University of Kentucky archives until it was quietly removed in 1974. A graduate student had photocopied portions of it before its disappearance. Dr. Field Marsh described visiting a settlement he called the Cade Hollow, a cluster of 7 cabins built in a horseshoe formation around a central fire pit. He estimated 30 to 40 residents, though he noted that the exact count proved impossible, as many inhabitants concealed themselves upon my arrival. He was allowed to examine 6 children. His notes are clinical, but the horror is unmistakable. Patient C3, male, approximate age 7, cranial circumference significantly below norm, microcephaly evident. Eyes exhibit severe strabismus, left eye fixed medially, right eye appears non-functional. Jaw protrudes at unnatural angle. Teeth present but irregular, some erupting through cheek tissue rather than gum line. Patient non-verbal. Mother states he has never learned speech. Father refused to provide medical history. When pressed, father stated, He's a Cade. That's all you need know. Patient C5, female, approximate age 12. Severe spinal curvature. Kyphosis and scoliosis both present. Unable to stand upright. Limbs asymmetrical. Left arm terminates at elbow in fused massive fingers. Right arm appears normal but atrophied. Patient responded to verbal commands, but made no sound. Grandmother present during examination. When I inquired about patient's father, grandmother replied, same as her grandfather. I did not ask further questions. Dr. Field Marsh's report concluded with a single recommendation: immediate intervention by state authority. This population exhibits signs of advanced genetic degradation due to sustained consanguinity. Without external introduction of genetic diversity, I believe the line will collapse within 2 generations. I further recommend consideration of sterilization under Kentucky's new eugenic statutes. No intervention occurred. The report was filed and forgotten. But Dr. Field Marsh had planted a seed. Because 23 years later, when Halbrook County finally opened a public hospital, the state sent someone to monitor it. Halbrook County Hospital opened in 1934, funded by a New Deal Public Works initiative. It was a small facility, 20 beds, 1 operating theater, and a basement used for storage and morgue services. The hospital employed a single full-time physician, Dr. Raymond Kubler, and a rotating staff of nurses, most of whom didn't last more than a few months. Dr. Kubler kept meticulous records. His patient logs preserved in the Kentucky State Archives show that between 1934 and 1947, he treated over 200 members of the Torrence-Cade families. The majority of cases involved children, and the majority of those cases involved what Kubler categorized as congenital abnormalities of unknown etiology. He listed them in stark medical shorthand: anencephaly, partial; polydactyly, bilateral extreme; fusion of digits; non-surgical correction impossible; cranial malformation; fontanelle failed to close, age 9; skeletal dysplasia; femur and tibia fused at birth; ocular degeneration; bilateral blindness, no response to light. But Kubler's written reports tell only part of the story. Because in 1938, Kubler began photographing his patients. The photographs were never meant to be seen. Kubler stored them in a locked cabinet in the hospital basement, far from the patient files kept on the main floor. He labeled them only with numbers. No names, no dates that could easily be cross-referenced. On the back of each photograph he wrote a single word: contraindicated. It was a medical term. It meant inadvisable. In the context of these images, it likely referred to reproduction. The photographs themselves are almost impossible to describe without sounding sensational, but the details are a matter of record. Patient 014 was a boy, perhaps 10 years old, photographed seated in a wooden chair. His head was grotesquely enlarged, the skull bulging asymmetrically to the left. His eyes were different sizes. His mouth hung open, revealing a tongue too large for the oral cavity. His hands, resting on his knees, had 7 fingers each, fused in pairs. Patient 047 was a girl. Her face was captured in profile because, as the photograph shows, the right side of her skull had not fully formed. A section of her cranium was missing, covered only by a thin membrane of tissue. Her left eye was normal. Her right eye socket was empty. Patient 089 was an infant. The photograph was taken at what appears to be an autopsy. The child's body was opened along the sternum. Kubler had annotated the image with arrows pointing to the internal organs. The liver was on the wrong side. The heart had 3 chambers instead of 4. The spine bifurcated at the lumbar region, splitting into 2 incomplete columns. And there were others. Patient 112, a teenager with legs that bent backward at the knee. Patient 158, a toddler whose arms had grown fused to the torso, immobile. Patient 203, a young woman whose jawbone had grown in a continuous loop, teeth erupting in a circle rather than a line, Every single patient shared the same surnames: Torrence-Cade, Torrence-Cade. Kubler never published his findings. He never reported them to the State Medical Board. And when he died suddenly in 1947, officially listed as a heart attack, though he was only 51 years old, the hospital sealed the basement and installed a new physician who asked no questions. The photographs remained in the dark for 12 years. By the 1940s, the Torrence-Cade bloodline had become a biological paradox. It should not have been able to sustain itself. Geneticists today estimate that a population requires a minimum of 50 reproductively active, unrelated individuals to avoid lethal inbreeding depression. The Torrence-Cades had operated with fewer than 20 for over a century. The results were catastrophic. A comparative study conducted decades later, using genealogical records cross-referenced with Kubler's patient logs, revealed that between 1900 and 1950, the Torrence-Cade families experienced an infant mortality rate of 61%, more than 5 times the national average. A rate of congenital deformity estimated at 34% compared to a national baseline of less than 3%. A complete absence of any documented individual living past the age of 47. But the photographs told a darker story. Because Kubler hadn't just been documenting medical anomalies, he had been tracking a pattern. On the back of several photographs, beneath the word contraindicated, Kubler had added notes: short, fragmentary, almost fearful. On the image of patient 112, he wrote, "Father is also uncle, mother is cousin to both parents, third generation identical pairing." On patient 158, family tree collapses into single branch 1837, no external genetic input since. On patient 203, mother delivered 4 previous stillbirths, all identical malformation. She insists on continued attempts. And on one photograph, a group image showing 7 children of varying ages, all seated on the porch of a cabin, Kubler wrote only this: "They call this keeping the blood pure. I call it damnation." In August of 1952, the main Torrance homestead burned to the ground. The fire was reported by a mail carrier who noticed smoke rising from the ridgeline. By the time the volunteer fire brigade arrived, the structure was gone. 7 bodies were recovered from the ashes, burned beyond visual identification. The county coroner listed the cause of death as smoke inhalation and attributed the fire to accidental causes, likely a cooking stove. But a handwritten addendum, filed separately, tells a different story. The coroner noted that all 7 bodies were found in the same room, a back bedroom with a single window nailed shut from the outside. He also noted the presence of an accelerant, likely kerosene, concentrated near the bedroom door. He concluded, unable to rule out foul play. However, given the isolation of the property and the lack of witnesses, further investigation is not feasible. The bodies were buried in an unmarked plot on Torrance land. No death certificates were issued, and in the months that followed, something changed. Families in the surrounding valleys began to report sightings of Torrence-Cade family members in town, something that had been exceedingly rare. They came to buy supplies, to attend church services, to enroll children in the county school. They spoke to neighbors. They seemed, for the first time in generations, to be rejoining the world. But the children they brought with them were different. Teachers at the Halbrook County School reported that several of the Torrence-Cade children enrolled in 1953 exhibited developmental delays and physical abnormalities, but none of the extreme deformities documented in Kubler's photographs. A school nurse noted that the children were malnourished and poorly socialized, but otherwise within normal parameters. It was as if the most severely affected members of the bloodline had simply vanished. In 1954, the Kentucky Department of Health launched a quiet investigation into Halbrook County Hospital. The investigation was triggered not by the photographs, which had not yet been discovered, but by an anonymous letter sent to the state capitol. The letter, written in careful block print, stated, "There are children in Halbrook County who should not exist. The hospital knows. The doctors know. Someone has been making sure the worst ones never leave. You need to look in the basement." The letter was signed, "A nurse who could not stay silent." 2 investigators were dispatched. They interviewed hospital staff, reviewed patient logs, and examined the facility from top to bottom. Their report, filed 3 months later, concluded that no evidence of wrongdoing or medical malpractice was found. But the report contained a curious note in its appendix. During the course of our investigation, we were denied access to a storage area in the hospital basement, which staff indicated was sealed due to structural concerns. Attempts to obtain a key or authorization to open the area were refused by hospital administration. We were informed that the area had been unused since 1947 and contained only outdated medical supplies. Given the lack of immediate safety concern, we did not pursue the matter further. The cabinet with the photographs was behind that sealed door. It would remain there untouched for 5 more years. By 1960, the Torrence-Cade bloodline had effectively ended. Census records from that year show only 11 individuals bearing either surname, all over the age of 50. No births had been recorded in the county under those names since 1956. The family land was gradually sold off or abandoned. The cabins in Cade Hollow collapsed into the earth, and the photographs, once they were confiscated by federal authorities, disappeared into a classification system that ensured they would never be seen again. Or so the government believed. But in 1978, a reporter for a Louisville newspaper received an unmarked envelope in the mail. Inside were 12 photographs, grainy, clearly copied from originals, but unmistakable in their content. The images showed the same deformities, the same children, the same annotations in Kubler's handwriting. The reporter began investigating. He contacted the Kentucky State Archives. He filed Freedom of Information requests. He traveled to Halbrook County and interviewed elderly residents who remembered the Torrance and Cade families. One woman, aged 83, told him, "We all knew what was happening up in those hollers, but nobody talked about it. You didn't talk about the Torrances or the Cades. You just looked the other way. Because if you didn't, sometimes they'd come down from the ridge at night, and you'd hear them outside your house just standing there, breathing." The reporter's investigation was never published. His editor killed the story, citing lack of corroborating evidence and concerns about libel. The reporter was reassigned. He left journalism 2 years later. But the photographs continued to circulate. Copies appeared in medical ethics textbooks, always uncredited, in underground documentaries about eugenics, in online archives dedicated to forbidden history. Each time they were treated as myth, as hoax, as exaggeration. But they were real. And in the hills of eastern Kentucky, in the places where the maps still go blank, there are people who remember. In 2003, a team of researchers from the University of Kentucky's Anthropology Department conducted a survey of historical burial sites in Halbrook County. Using ground-penetrating radar, they identified over 200 graves in an area known locally as the Cade Cemetery, though no markers or records indicated it had ever been used as such. The graves were shallow, irregular. Many contained multiple sets of remains. The researchers applied for a permit to exhume and study the remains. The permit was denied by the county, the state, and ultimately by a federal judge, who ruled that the disturbance of these graves would serve no legitimate scientific or historical purpose and would constitute a violation of the descendants' right to privacy. No descendants came forward to claim the graves. The site was quietly fenced off and left to the woods. But one of the researchers, in an interview years later, said this: "We ran preliminary analyses on 3 of the graves, the ones closest to the access road, where we could get equipment in without violating the court order. The remains we found weren't just deformed. They were, I don't even know how to describe it. Bones that had fused in ways that shouldn't be anatomically possible. Skulls with growth patterns that didn't match any known condition. One set of remains, a child, maybe 6 or 7 years old, had a spinal column that split into 2 separate vertebral chains halfway down the back. Both chains were complete, Both were fused to the same pelvis. I've studied skeletal pathology for 20 years. I've never seen anything like it, and I never want to again. The photographs from Halbrook County Hospital were never officially declassified. The families whose names appear in Kubler's notes are gone now. Their bloodline dissolved into history. The hospital was demolished in 1960 and replaced with a parking lot. The graves remain undisturbed. The stories remain unconfirmed. But in the archives, in the margins of forgotten reports, in the whispered memories of those who lived nearby, the truth lingers. The Torrence-Cade bloodline wasn't an accident. It wasn't ignorance or isolation alone that created what Kubler photographed in that basement. It was a choice, made generation after generation, to keep the blood pure, to refuse the outside world, to believe that their lineage was something sacred, something worth preserving at any cost. And the cost was their children. The photographs are still out there, copies of copies, passed through hands that don't fully understand what they're seeing. Sometimes they surface on message boards, in documentaries, in the dark corners of the internet where people trade in the grotesque and the forbidden. And every time someone sees them, the same question arises: how could this have been allowed to happen? But the answer is simpler than we'd like to admit. It happened because no one stopped it. Because the people who knew looked the other way. Because the authorities who could have intervened chose not to. Because it was easier to let the Torrances and the Cades disappear into the mountains than to confront what was being done in those isolated hollows. And so the children were born and photographed and buried in unmarked graves. And the only record of their existence is a locked filing cabinet in a basement that no longer exists. The bloodline may be gone, but the photographs remain. And in the hills of eastern Kentucky, when the fog rolls in and the night grows silent, some people still say you can hear them. The children who were never meant to be, standing just beyond the tree line, breathing in the dark, waiting to be remembered.